we were running in and out of Miami 2 or 3 times a week, so that well, some of our crew knew or met Jim Hawley down there, and I guess you could say they recruited him, or they told him to check with us and we would probably hire him, which we did, of course. But he was one of the top pilots we ever had. And during that 12 years of our operation, when we were in common carriage selling tickets to the general public, same as American United did, we, in that period of time, we never stressed the passengers. We never had any, there were no safety problems at all. We had a perfect safety record. And so did North American Airlines and Great Lakes Airlines. They too were put out of business because they were selling tickets. The cardinal sin in the civil aeronautics board's view was if you sold tickets, like engaged in common carriage, well, those 2 airlines and ours, the 3 of us, were targets for the Civil Aeronautics Board to put out of business. And they finally did. They put us all out of business, but not one of those carriers, the 3 of us, we all 3 had a perfect safety record. Not one of them scratched a passenger in that 12-year period of time, which really is a remarkable record when you think about it. The major airlines were having accidents all the time. During that 10 or 12-year period, there were several very serious major airline accidents. But the CAB was always trying to accuse us of not being safe.
Some of the safety records due to the non-sked airlines was the fact that so many pilots came back from the war with lots of real-world experience under their belts, flying in high altitudes and high winds and bad weather. It took a lot of skill to captain safely aircraft in the 1950s and 60s. In the case of my own father, he flew in World War II in the Himalayas. He was in the China, Burma, India campaign and flew at high altitude with turbocharged C-46 aircraft, flying supplies between India and China to supply the Chinese against the fight against the Japanese in World War II. And he took that experience with him to South America and helped form an airline there called Endesa. And from there, we went on to Florida and flew for another dozen years in the Miami area. So I think some of the record here for some of these airlines was due to the high experience of these pilots after the war. It was certainly a factor, and I would proudly say that in his whole career he never had an accident or an incident. And he flew from 1938 until he retired as a DC-10 captain with Trans-America Airlines in 1978. That was 40 years of flying with an unblemished record. And I think he quoted me, he had also spent something like 36,000 hours in the air, which amounts to about 4 years of being disconnected from the earth.
Because the federal government, when the war ended, had a lot of surplus transport airplanes. So they put out information and propaganda urging former military pilots, now on inactive duty, to start your own airline. And we were encouraged to get into business as an airline by our own federal government. Of course, at the same time, the other part of the federal government, the Civil Aeronautics Board, did everything in their power to kill us in our infancy. And from the day we began operations in Miami in early 1946, and also in the Burbank, California area, there were some 500 non-sked airlines that came into being. And there was heavy attrition, of course, and when we were finally all destroyed in late 1964, there were only 10 or 15 left. They had put carriers out of business. The term non-scheduled airline was created by the Civil Aeronautics Board refusing to allow us to fly a schedule. Well, how can you tell the public where you're going to, how you can transport them without them knowing you have a schedule to fly? They did everything they could to kill the industry. And they finally succeeded. But the Civil Aeronautics Board was one of the worst agencies that the government ever created. They were finally put out of business. But they were nothing but a tool of the major airlines. The major airlines would send one of its own employees down to apply with the Civil Aeronautics Board for a job. So within the CAB itself, and even unknown to the CAB, were, you might call them fifth columnists, they were major airline saboteurs within the Civil Aeronautics Board, and their mission was to do as much damage as they could to destroy the non-sked industry. And they were paid by the major airlines. United had one in there for many years. And nobody knew that he was an employee, really, of United rather than of the Civil Aeronautics Board. You had the FAA, and they would come down and harass us, is what they did. They had never run an airline. They wouldn't know how to sell a ticket. They wouldn't know how and yet they tried to tell us how to run an airline. And they had no background, no qualifications whatsoever. They had never run a lemonade stand, yet they would come down and harass our company, who had pioneered in many former Civil Aeronautics Board chairman, Alfred Kahn, wrote a book. He had been an economist from Colgate University. And he wrote a book in which he said the only advancements made in air transport came from the non-sked industry. Air freight, all expense tours, high density seating, coach fares, they were all developed by the non-skeds. And all of them, they've taken over by the major airlines. So here we were harassed not only by the CAB, but the FAA. And what did the FAA know about running an airline when you come right down to it? They didn't know anything about it. We had our own safety procedures. Otherwise, we would not have had a perfect safety record. It wasn't the FAA that initiated our training and our safety measures and maintenance and crew qualifications. That was our job, and we obviously did a pretty good job of it. the industry has lost, the military has lost a lot. We were on the Berlin airlift. And the dew line. And we were a reserve, standby, ready reserve for the Air Transport Command. Major airlines were also, but the non-skeds were immediately available. They didn't have, they were able to, they were much more flexible in their operations. Proof of that being the dew line and Berlin airlift and all those other operations we performed for the military. It's a long, sad story, and it's gone, it's over. And the airlines today, some of our worst enemies like Pan American, TWA, and Eastern, even they're gone. That's a great loss to our defense posture. We're now so short of air transport that a lot of the air transport requirements are now purchased from foreign airlines for this operation in the Middle East today. It's a pretty sad story. But you would wonder where the generals and the admirals and the experts on air transport were to allow this to happen, to allow Douglas to be put out of business and Grumman. Greatly weakening our defenses. Drone flight simulator took 5 years, and it could perform 90% of our training. It was that complete. And there was the whole front end of a DC-4 with all the instruments and all the equipment needed for training. And this was developed when most of the flight training gadgetry were late trainers. They didn't have complete cockpit simulators that we ended up with. And finally the FAA gave us, I think 75% of our training could be done in that simulator rather than on the airplane itself, which of course saved a lot of money. It was a lot cheaper to run the simulator than to run a DC-4 or DC-6 or 7.
So what happened to the simulator?
The simulator, I let the guy that built it for us, I let him have it to use when we were put out of business. And he took it to California, and I guess it's gone now. I don't know what's happened. He may not even be living, for that matter. But we lost it, and I'm sorry we lost it. I've got photographs of it. Now, the other thing we did was sort of unusual. This outfit in Philadelphia that has, what would that be? It was part of a zoo, I guess.
An aquarium?
They want live whales, and they capture these whales up in Newfoundland. And we flew 2 airplanes up there, and they were loaded aboard the plane, which was a major job. And then we had to pour water over them the entire trip down to Philadelphia to keep them wet. And we got them here, they were alive, and they put in this zoo in Philadelphia. That was the first time that live whales had ever been flown in an airplane.
Well, that showed a lot of innovation in transport and ideas.
Oh yeah, we had to devise our own system we had to put padding down under the whales so that they wouldn't get bruised or harmed in any way. The major airlines would not have done that. They were not that flexible. I keep thinking of the DO line. It couldn't have been built without the non-sked airlines. Flying Tigers participated in the DO line, Great Lakes, our company, USOA. The major airlines, they just wouldn't even consider it because there were no navigation facilities at all. We had to dead reckon up into the north there and land on frozen lakes, and the weather wasn't too good either. We operated out of Montreal under Canadian operations. But that DO line was quite an operation. And then of course it became obsolete when they got satellites. But had the Russians come across the North Pole, at that time they were fearful they might, the DO line would have intercepted them.
So the DO line was called Distance Early Warning Radar Network for detection of Russian missiles and aircraft.
Right.
In the
it ran
mid-1950s, correct?
It ran from from Alaska to Frobisher, ran right across Canada. And it worked fine. Until they got satellites, which made it obsolete. But what a job to build a series of radar stations. I can't remember how many they built, but there were a lot of them. Across that frozen Arctic, north of the Arctic Circle. When it would get 30 degrees below zero at certain times of the year. They couldn't have built it without the non-sked airlines, though. Because everything had to be flown in. There's no way to transport it by surface. And those lakes we landed on, they were 100 feet thick. The ice was that thick over a period of thousands of years.